All right, we are back on the podcast where we are training men in spiritual fitness. I am Evan McGinty here with my friend Joe Barnard. Joe, how are you doing today?
Doing well, doing well. Yeah, Friday afternoon, and looking forward to Saturday, and looking forward to Sunday. So almost there.
Excellent, excellent. I am ready to jump into this conversation. This is one I've been eager to have with you since you sent me kind of the list of books that you and I would read together. And for those guys that are maybe just jumping into this episode, what Joe and I have been doing is trying to answer this question: what does it mean to be a man? What is biblical masculinity? And we've been taking a few weeks to just kind of read a book that talks or touches on that theme, and then just discuss it, kind of interact with the material within the book. Well, how does this apply to the lives of Christian men, ordinary Christian men? And so we've done several books now at this point, but we've got a unique one today. We got Extreme Ownership, and this is different from some of the ones you and I have discussed over the past few weeks, because I think, at least that I can remember, all the other ones have been more on like the Christian bookshelf, realm. This is the first one outside of that, which is a little scary, but also to me really exciting because I think there's a lot of good to be found here. But let me start this just by, okay, why was this one on the list? Why are we discussing this book, Joe?
I think one the core idea is something that is important biblically. So he's not deriving it from the Bible, but we've said this in prior weeks that taking responsibility, that this is part of the essence of what it means to be a man. And so he's going to take that and he's going to really illustrate it and drive it home with a sort of power and a kind of leaves an impression that I think is almost unique. So
Yeah.
I think I've talked to this book has come up with pastors, it's come up with friends, it's come up with guys in the business world. And the strange thing is you don't walk away from this book unaffected. And that's
Yeah.
pretty uncommon. So one, I think it's getting at a truth. Secondly, it's got guys' attention already. And so I
Yeah.
think we can bring this together in a really helpful way for guys asking the same question as us. What does it mean to be a man?
Yeah, you're right. It is one of these that has the attention of guys. I mean, it's written by a Navy SEAL, Jocko Willink. This is like, that's like the thing these days. If you got something written by a Navy SEAL, you've got some
That's right.
gravitas behind you. But the truth is, I think it's worth just talking about because this is a felt need, I think, for a lot of guys. We find ourselves in this time where guys are tired of hearing, oh, you know what? It's not my fault. It's not like we really are, right? If we look down and say we're tired as fathers as hearing it's not my fault, and we're tired of being the guys that say that as well. So I think there is something that men see in this idea of extreme ownership. They see it as virtuous and almost attractive. And I think that's why guys are reading this book. That's why they're grabbing it off the bookshelf. And so I think it is something worth discussing for us today as we're on this journey of trying to say, okay, well, what does it mean to be a man, and how does ownership, extreme ownership play into that? So let's start by maybe just giving some clarity to that definition. What's so extreme about ownership? What does he mean when he says extreme ownership?
And I think what the extreme is the degree to which he's challenging men to take responsibility. And
Mhm.
so what we often do is, we first start with some excuses. We blame our
Mhm.
circumstances. We look at our kids, our wife, our income, whatever, and say, I don't have the control that I should have, or my problem, it involves my boss. I'm limited in my role within the company, and he's wanting to say, look, what you have to start with is that you're the one to blame. Like if there's a problem, don't point the finger anywhere else.
Yeah.
Take accountability, um, and begin from that position of feeling that the weight is actually on your shoulders in order to be able to move in a direction that's good. And so I think just that radical, he really wants grab hold of whatever the problem is in your life and say that I'm responsible for this. So what am I going to do about it?
Yeah, it's that idea of no complaining about this and the scenario, whatever it is. You got to face the challenge, whatever it is that's ahead of you, and find solutions to move forward with the people that are around you. And he uses, obviously teamwork examples within the Navy SEALs, but also the business world. But I think it's worth thinking about in the context also of just the home, church, even
Yeah.
just your life as a man in general. What does it look like to really believe and take ownership and take responsibility for the failures around you and work towards solutions? I, what if you gave me, I guess, a little bit of a vision of life, of manhood, and masculinity without this idea of extreme ownership? Let's start there. Like, what would it look like to have manhood without responsibility and taking this extreme ownership?
I mean, I think this is where the Bible begins, right? With Adam and Eve, and the way that Adam immediately throws, Eve under the bus and wants to blame Eve, for the whole problem of the forbidden fruit and the sin. And the last thing he wants is to actually recognize that no, he was the one that was put in this position of authority and responsibility, and that whatever happened, it was under his watch, and so he therefore is responsible before God. And so I think when you look at the kind of unraveling that occurs, it goes back. Calvin's famous for saying that what Adam should have done is he should have, struck the serpent on the head and thrown him out of the garden. Like he should have
Yeah.
taken responsibility, at the first sign of some sort of intruder, and he didn't do it. And so
Yeah.
I think, when you look at the Bible, when you see an irresponsible king, like Saul,
Mm.
or there's any number of instances where people in positions where they should take ownership and see that they're responsible for the sheep, often as the metaphor of the shepherd and the sheep, and
Mm.
they don't, and then the sheep suffer underneath it as a consequence. And so that's what we want to avoid. We want to
Yeah.
be the actual kind of shepherds that's illustrated by the good shepherd himself.
Mm. Yeah, so I was thinking about it too. There's some, I think, uniquely Christian ways that this goes wrong as far as accepting ownership and thinking about taking responsibility. One that I hear sometimes in some Christian circles is when something goes wrong or there's a failure in life personally or even within a family. There's this idea of, well, the devil made me do it, or it was a demon, even, and that kind of thing. And I'm not, look, I believe in the devil, believe in demons, all of that, but sometimes I think it's within us to just pass the buck and pass the
Yeah,
blame and say, you know what, that this thing that's going on in my life, it's not my sin or it's not my fault or it's not, let me place this on some outside force or some outside thing or some other person or some other
yeah,
situation, as opposed to accepting the blame, taking it, confessing and believing, actually, okay, I've got to take some responsibility here for what's happening in my life, for what's happening in my family's life. I think even you see some positive examples of this. There's certainly negative examples within the Bible of this, but there's positive examples too. I think of like Psalm 51 to me is like a great example of what it looks like to take extreme ownership of a situation that, hey, I confess my sin. And this is, David goes into just excruciating detail of how he's done wrong. And that's a great example of taking responsibility. There's even times where the Bible talks about like all Israel coming and saying and confessing not only their sins, but the sins
yeah,
of their ancestors.
yeah,
And it's basically this
yeah.
idea
That's
of,
pretty extreme.
yeah, yeah. This is all our fault. Everything for all this is we accept blame. This is our fault. So I think there are some good examples within the Bible, but unfortunately, we do see a lot of bad examples of masculinity, and I don't think it's incomplete masculinity, where ownership isn't involved, where we're passing the blame, not taking on responsibility, and no one wants to be married to that guy. No one wants to have that guy as their dad, as their father. So maybe let's talk a little bit about that. Maybe Joe, describe for me a household where the husband or the father implements some of the principles from this book. What's noticeably different about that household where the husband or the father is taking on the principles of extreme ownership?
I think it's easy, and guys, I mean, we get labeled for this. It's easy to almost feel impotent, like you have
Mm.
no ability to change. And so as a result, we become passive. And so think of the stereotypical, the marriage that's falling apart, and the dad just kind of sitting there, the voice of the wife kind of in his ear, and he's just disengaged. Or the idiot dad whose son and daughter are doing whatever they want
Mm.
underneath his care, his house out of control. And again, he's just watching TV. And the strange thing, there's a strange thing about this book in that it'd be easy for it to come across as a message that would leave you feeling very guilty
Yeah.
and ashamed. But for some reason, it actually, I think, has the opposite effect. And I've seen this
Mhm.
repeatedly in guys that have read this book, that somehow it's empowering because there's something in us that has believed a lie, which is that we just can't do anything to improve our situation when actually he's given us authority often to do so,
Hmm.
and he's given us ability. And so, I mean, I just think even in my household and my family, there's always things that are beginning to kind of fall apart. That any system sort of decays over time, and so
Yeah.
you kind of see things, and then all of a sudden stepping back and realize, wait a second, like yeah, my kids, I've now got teenagers,
Hmm.
but that doesn't mean that all of a sudden that I have no ability to have some sort of positive influence. That actually there are any number of ways, not with like an authoritarian like club that I'm beating them, but I can take responsibility to get to know them again, to feed
Hmm.
into their life wisdom, you know, to be able to continue to shape their heart and their mind. And being told that I can take ownership, that it's not dependent upon all of them, but actually there's things I can do right now in my marriage and my family. Again, that's a message that actually gives me great hope.
Yes. Yeah, I love that. There are things I can do right now. I think you're right. That's where this book is very inspiring and gives us a sense of, wow, there are problems to solve, not just this weight of, oh, it's all my fault, I take the blame, but wait, there are steps forward that I can take. Because I think about, yeah, what does this look like played out in a home? I think it's that idea that say you find your son looking at something on his computer that he's not supposed to be
Yeah,
looking at, or watching endless YouTube videos, whatever it may be. It's looking at that situation saying, that's my fault. Because I'm the
yeah,
one that hasn't set up systems in our household that prevents that, or I'm the one that hasn't had those conversations. I'm the one that
yeah,
hasn't trained him to think in such a way. So there's one way in which you can find your kid doing something wrong and say, this is your fault, you're to blame, and you've got to correct. And I think that's where a lot of men go wrong is we say we want to be leaders in the home, but really we want to be dictators. And we want to say, do these things this way and
yeah,
expect them to do it all perfectly. But a leader says, wait, when something goes wrong, and it inevitably will, they say, wait, I have responsibility in this. I must not have been clear about the directions. I must not have been clear about why we don't do things that way. Because if I was clear about why we don't act that way or why we don't choose to do these things, then my son or daughter wouldn't have done that. And so it's taking responsibility, doubling down on the clarity, doubling down on the awareness of what's going around you, and saying, wait a second, hold on, I'm to blame here. As the leader of my home, I'm to blame here, and not just falling under the weight of that. Oh, it's all my fault and
yeah,
I get stuck. But no, saying, I'm to blame here. Let me find solutions forward. Let me gather everybody up and do whatever it takes to find some forward momentum within my home.
yeah.
What else? Anything else on the household or husbands, fathers that you think?
Well, I think again, I feel like a journey that I'm going through personally, and I think other
Yeah.
guys will feel the same. But a couple of movies recently
Mm.
that have kind of fed into this thought that I recommend guys watching. One's an old one, so haven't you heard me talk about this?
Yeah.
Captain's Courageous. There's a 1937, actually won like I think an Oscar. So guys need to watch it. It's this incredible story, really about fatherhood and
Mm.
boys growing up into men, but it starts with his dad. His son's out of control, and what you
Mm.
see is it takes the whole movie, but him to realize that that's on him. He's the one who made the mistake, and you see him re-engage, and all of a sudden that
Yeah.
relationship be transformed through it. I think
Yeah.
the other one, recently watched again, We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson, and this typical war film. He's dropped into the middle of a terrible situation. What he doesn't do is just all of a sudden feel self-pity and blame all of his superiors. He
Mm.
digs in and figures out, what do I need to do with the guys under my care to get us through this situation. And I think those kind of examples, guys need to be looking to see, what does it look like? Again, we're not out on the battlefield, but we are given a home. And how do I take responsibility, like you said, and begin to make changes that can be a blessing to everybody who's around me?
Mm. It's good. I also, one of the thoughts that crossed my mind as I was reading this book is just imagining that scenario of sitting around a fire pit with a group of guys who are talking about their wives, but they're talking and not complaining about their wives. Can you imagine sitting around? Because complaining, that's the battle cry of the weak and the prideful. Like that's saying, oh, it's all her fault, and here's all the things that what he's saying in extreme ownership is, wait a second. Again, we've got a part to play here. We've got to take responsibility for everything that's going on around us. And complaining gets you nowhere. This is not forward momentum in your home. This is not forward momentum in your relationship. And so it's, yeah, no complaining, take responsibility and move forward. Not just, man, can you imagine the kind of conversations we'd have about our children, about our wives, the kind of forward momentum we may actually have if we took these principles and played them out and played them forward. Um, all right. Well, let's talk a little bit about what's at the root of this, some of this. And he gets into this some in the book as well. But what do you think is kind of at the root of men doing this whole deflecting, passing the blame, complaining, or just in general being passive and not taking ownership or responsibility? What do you find is at the root of that?
I mean, there's nothing super profound here. I think we've got to acknowledge just the sin, the deep sin within us. And I think
Hmm.
there's a there's particular kind of masculine sins and feminine sins, and I think one of the particular masculine ones is to do the opposite of what we were created to do, which is to take responsibility, and the opposite of that is to abdicate responsibility. And I mean, you can read throughout all of not just the Bible but through church history, or not church history, just human history.
Mm.
And how many times do men abdicate responsibility?
Yep.
Are they uninvolved in the lives of their children? Are they disengaged in their marriage? Are they unwilling to volunteer within church? Are they in political offices and still blaming other people instead of owning, their own decisions? I mean, it's just the typical sin of men, which means we really have to keep watch for it because we're not immune to it.
Hmm. Yeah, it's all the typical things. It's pride, it's ego, even fear. I think there's some self-preservation that feeds into this
Yeah.
as well. Some of the reason, and guys just have we have thin skin in a lot of ways. We say, I think guys will tell you, they're eager to tell you, they're eager to tell their wives, that they want to be respected, that what I want is respect. But men want respect without criticism. And that just doesn't work. At some point, there needs to be, oh, wait, I didn't do something right. And so respect comes alongside of being able to be criticized and saying, you know what, it's my fault. I did mess up. And I think at the root of a lot of this is that we think that if we say it's my fault and we raise our hand and say, you know what, this is on me, we think that people won't respect us. And that's just simply not true. And I think that is what's empowering about this book is that it does say this is a guy who's saying just take all the blame for everything.
Yeah.
And you respect the heck out of him when he says it. And so it fights that thing within us that says, I won't have the respect of others if I stand up and take the blame. And it's just simply not true. The way to be a true leader, the way to be a man of God is to stand up and say, this is on me, and we're going to find a path forward. So it's just fighting against that's within us, that ego, that pride, that thin skin that we all have. Um,
And I would, just to illustrate that, I think one of my heroes, one of my mentors, someone who passed away this last year, but a story from his life that so stands out to me is growing up. I really family. Thought they were a wonderful example of a godly family. But when his kids were in high school, took them to Florida and had been really convicted in front of all of them. He washed their feet. He
oh,
apologized for things he'd not done as a father for them.
mm,
And that was deeply moving for that family. And there were changes that resulted that really impacted those kids. As he, in a sense, was saying, hey, I want to come back into your life later, but as a
mm,
father in a different way. But it affected me as well. This picture of a man, a wonderful man, a godly man, but a man willing to admit his fault to
mm,
that degree, get down, even wash the feet of his family members, and to, in a sense, start again. And
mm.
I thought, that I think guys, we have to be willing and realize that it's not really a sign of weakness, like you said, that's a sign of integrity,
Yes.
because inevitably we failed. To admit it, the truth is the people around us see it already. We're the last to get the notice. But acknowledging it and then earning that trust so that we can then have a deeper impact later on.
Uh, all right. So there's an idea in this book that I want us to interact with a little bit as he talks about this difference between taking responsibility for your job, your unique job or role within a company or within a team, and then the difference between that and taking just extreme ownership over the entire mission. So what did you see as the difference there? Because I thought that was a good point. That okay, there's one thing to take responsibility for your job. It's another thing to take extreme ownership for the mission as a whole. What do you think he meant there, and how does that kind of play out in the life of Christian men?
Yeah, obviously, a mission is a much bigger thing, much bigger activity than a single job. You're not viewing yourself as just having a very finite role. So maybe I'll make sure that my job's taken care of, but the bigger problems I'll kind of pass up and forget about. But you're seeing a much greater picture, feeling the much greater weight of responsibility for something that involves people. And I
Mm-hmm.
think something like, for example, being a father, like that's not a job. Like if you view it as a job, that's too small. Like you've been entrusted with a mission that will be like but unlike the mission of every other dad that's ever existed. No other dad has had your particular family.
Mm-hmm.
For you to undertake that mission, which is to protect, to provide, to train up and educate in the ways of God, the next generation, all of these things, um, that's going to involve a degree of oversight, a degree of strategic thinking, a degree of prayerfulness if you're a Christian. That's going to be a totally different mentality than my job is just to get a check, make sure I can pay for them to go to school and
Mm-hmm.
take them on church on Sunday. That's too small to be
Yeah.
able to be faithful to the role you've been given. You've got to think of it as a mission and take responsibility for it as a mission in order to even begin to think about what stewardship looks like.
Yeah, and think about the man, the vision of what this could do for the world, for the sake of Christ, if men started to take this on. I mean, think about it. Okay, so one problem we have is men in churches who silo themselves and their job and their role, but maybe don't take responsibility for the mission of the church. What would it look like to have churches full of men who cared about the mission of the church, not just their own individual role within the church, but what would it feel like as a pastor to lead a church full of men who took ownership over the mission of the church? And then beyond that, what would it look like for churches to take ownership over the mission in within your community? How would you have to work alongside other churches and put aside your ego and your pride
Yeah.
and to continue to work? Like, just think about the worldwide implications as Christians if we not only just stood in our own individual role but said, wait a second, there's a grander mission here that we're all a part of. Within
Yeah.
my church, I fight for that mission and I take responsibility. When my church is failing, I take some ownership of that. When my community is failing, I take ownership of that. My church takes ownership of that. If we all had that mindset, if we all looked at things that way, I mean, imagine what a difference Christians could start to make if not just not just falling under the weight of that, but saying, okay, we own this. Now we're going to find solutions forward. Now we're going to work together better. Now I'm going to support the mission of my church and my pastor better. I'm going to support, the other churches that are around me better, my community as a whole. So yeah, I think it changes the way we see the outlook of our Christian life. It's outside of just ourselves and even outside of just our home. We have a bigger picture mission here. I know, gosh, here's the problem, Joe. You and I think, could talk on this subject forever. It was I will say, I'll let you have some kind of closing thoughts here. If there's anything else in particular in the book that you want to talk about, it was such I struggle to say it's a great book. It's a great idea in
Yeah.
a good book, if that's fair.
Yeah. Yeah.
For guys that are watching, it's too thick of a book to
Yeah.
be a great book, to be quite honest. Most of the book is stories. And so if
Yeah.
you're into like Navy SEAL stories, man, this is your gig. You're going to love this book. But if you really just want the principles, you could probably honestly just kind of Google online and find those principles printed out, because they're great principles, I think, for men to live by, kind of, packaged in a bunch of stories. But anything else from the book that stuck out to you that you think is worth mentioning for Christian men?
I think maybe the question some guys will have is, well, what's not in it, or
Hmm.
how must a Christian supplement
Yeah.
the truth, whatever truth is contained? Again, what he gets right, and this is fits squares with biblical truth, is that anybody in a role is responsible, and undoubtedly men are in roles of responsibility. So we need to take not just ownership, extreme ownership.
Mhm.
Of course, we also need to keep in mind is that there's grace, and then there's responsibility. And so in God. There's wisdom in God, that repentance is possible. So it's not just on us. God is able to redeem situations that would be far outside the reach of anything that we could change on our own. And so I think we can take the core idea, put it in a context of what we know is true, being in Christ, being given the Holy Spirit, being given the truth of God's word, and we can rework it in that context and really benefit from it. But certainly all of that would be what's missing from this book.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, guys, I hope you found this conversation helpful and just talking in and around this principle of taking extreme ownership. We hope that you will begin to take extreme ownership in your own life and see the difference that it makes. We're putting out every week in our newsletter. If you're not subscribed to our newsletter, I'd suggest you go and do that, because every week we do provide a brief book summary with like key insights, but also some conversation starters for you and your friends. So what would it look like? Maybe you don't want to read this whole book. That's okay. We'll give you like 4 or 5 questions that are worth discussing among your friends about extreme ownership in the Christian life. And so y'all check that out. We're also putting out blog posts on masculinity and what that looks like. So if you're not subscribed to our newsletter, you're going to want to get that so you can follow along. And again, if you have any other book recommendations that we can add to our list, we're eager to continue to go through this series. But y'all join us again next week for the Cross Training Ministries podcast.